Have you ever felt that the world had quietly stopped spinning just for you? That in the stillness, something was waiting to be found? Before we begin, if stories like this touch your heart, please like the video, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It means a lot to us. It was October 17th, a Tuesday. Rain tapped against the windows of Clara's apartment like a stranger begging to be let in. Outside, the streets of Portland were slick with fallen maple leaves, crimson and gold, clinging to wet pavement. The air smelled of damp earth and distant wood smoke. A gray light seeped through the curtains, turning everything the color of old silver. Clara sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. She'd been sitting there for an hour, or maybe two. Time had a way of stretching and snapping in the empty spaces after loss. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the funeral. Since the leukemia finally won its long, cruel war against her mother. Clara was 32 adrift. An only child, with a father who'd vanished decades ago, she felt like the last leaf clinging to a bare branch. Her job as a freelance graphic designer was all remote work, just pixels on a screen. No office chatter, no shared lunches, just silence. And in that silence, the grief echoed loudest. She'd moved into this small, ground-floor apartment 3 weeks ago, hoping a new space might mute the memories haunting her old one. It hadn't. Boxes still lined the walls, half unpacked. Like her heart, full of things she couldn't bear to look at. Then he appeared, not with a meow or a scratch at the door, but with silence. A shadow lingering at the edge of her overgrown backyard, beneath the dripping branches of a magnolia tree. Clara first saw him one sodden afternoon, while staring blankly out the kitchen window. A cat. Not just any cat. The tuxedo, black and white, but so thin his ribs pressed sharp against his fur like ridges on a washboard. One ear was nicked, a small, pale scar cutting through the black fur. It gave him a perpetually wary look. His eyes, they were extraordinary. A pale, almost luminous green. Intelligent. They held hers through the rain-streaked glass, not pleading, just seeing her. Really seeing her. In that split second, Clara felt less alone. She didn't rush out. Grief had made her cautious, brittle. What if he ran? What if he belonged to someone? What if caring just led to more hurt? But the next day, he was back. Hunched near the back steps, a dark smudge against the peeling gray paint. Clara slowly opened the back door, just a crack. Placed a saucer of leftover tuna, the cheap kind packed in oil, on the top step. She retreated inside, watched. He didn't move for 10 minutes. Just stared, those green eyes fixed on the door, then flicking to the food. Finally, hunger won. He crept forward, silent as smoke. Ate with fierce, desperate gulps, glancing up every few seconds, ready to bolt. When he finished, he didn't vanish. He sat, licked a white paw meticulously, then looked back at the door, at Clara's shadow behind it. One slow blink. Deliberate. Like a secret signal. She named him Silas. It felt like an old name, a quiet name. Suited him. He became a fixture. Not demanding, just present. Clara started putting food out morning and evening. Silas would appear like clockwork, materializing from the bushes or the alleyway. He never came inside, never tried to push past the door she left slightly ajar as the days grew colder. He'd eat, then sit on the top step, often gazing not at her, but out towards the street or up at the heavy, rain-laden sky. A stillness clung to him, a watchfulness that felt deeper than just animal caution. Sometimes, Clara would sit on the step beside him, careful not to touch. She'd talk, haltingly at first, then in a quiet stream. About her mom's laugh, how it used to fill a room. About the awful beige wallpaper in the hospice. About the crushing weight of emptying her childhood home, donating her mother's clothes, the scent of her perfume lingering in empty drawers. Silas never moved closer, but he listened. His ears would twitch slightly. His breathing, a soft, rhythmic whisper in the cool air. Once, when her voice cracked describing the final days, he turned his head, looked right at her. Not with pity, but with a quiet, shared understanding that stole her breath. This scarred, skinny stray understood the language of loss. November arrived, sharp and frosty. Mornings glittered with fragile ice on dead grass. Clara bought a cheap cat bed, a plaid fleece thing, and placed it just inside the back door, sheltered from the wind. Silas eyed it warily for days. One freezing night, with a storm whining in the wires, Clara peeked through the kitchen curtain before bed. He was there, curled tightly in the little bed, a black and white comma against the red fleece. His head rested on his paws, eyes closed. For the first time, he looked peaceful. Not just resting, but safe. A lump formed in Clara's throat. She whispered into the cold glass, "Good night, Silas." A tiny shift. His ear flicked. Maybe he heard. Maybe he dreamed. But in that silent apartment, heavy with the ghosts of the past, Clara felt the faintest, quietest tremor of warmth. Something was beginning. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a small, tentative unfurling, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. She didn't know it then, but Silas wasn't just a stray seeking shelter. He was a messenger, carrying a secret written not in ink, but in paw prints and time, and the unbreakable bond of a lost twin. The story, her story, was just starting to breathe. The rhythm of Silas became the quiet heartbeat of Clara's days. Mornings no longer began with the hollow dread of opening her eyes, but with the soft ritual of scraping tuna into a chipped blue bowl. She'd open the back door, a slice of cold, damp air rushing in, and place it carefully on the top step. The waiting began. Sometimes he'd already be there, a dark shape materializing from the mist clinging to the overgrown rhododendrons, his green eyes catching the weak November light. Other times, she'd return to her lukewarm coffee and watch through the window. 5 minutes, her breath fogging the glass. Then, a shift in the shadows beneath the magnolia. A ripple of movement. Silas would emerge, cautious, always cautious, pausing to scent the air, ears swiveling like radar dishes tuned to distant threats. He'd approach the bowl, not in a straight line, but in a series of wary arcs, stopping, listening, his thin frame taut with readiness to flee. The first time he didn't immediately bolt after eating, Clara held her breath. She said, a respectful 3 feet from the empty bowl, and began the meticulous ritual of cleaning his right forepaw. Lick, lick, lick. The rasp of his tongue against fur was surprisingly loud in the quiet yard. He paused, looked directly at the door, at her faint silhouette behind the glass. Then he did it again. That slow, deliberate blink. Eyes closing fully for a heartbeat, then opening, the pale green gaze steady. Clara instinctively blinked slowly back. A tiny thread, spun from silence and shared understanding, seemed to stretch between them. She felt a ridiculous warmth bloom behind her ribs. The cold deepened. Frost etched intricate, fragile patterns on the window panes overnight. Clara bought a ceramic heating pad, the kind meant for seedlings, and placed it beneath the plaid fleece bed just inside the door. She left the door cracked, a sliver of warmth spilling onto the cold concrete step. Silas began lingering longer after meals. He'd retreat to the heated bed, curl into a tight, black and white ball, and watch the world from his sheltered threshold. His eyes, Clara noticed, often followed the squirrels scrambling along the fence line, but with a detached curiosity, not a hunter's intensity. More often, they seemed fixed on something unseen, down the alley, or perhaps inward. A stillness clung to him that felt heavy, laden. Not just the stillness of an animal conserving energy, but the stillness of something waiting, or remembering. One bitter afternoon, wind whining around the corners of the old apartment building, Clara sat on the cold linoleum floor just inside the open door. Her back against the door frame, knees drawn up. She was talking, more to herself than to the cat, about the impossible task waiting in her living room. Boxes labeled "Mom's Sweaters." "Angora," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, lost in the wind. She loved that scratchy pink Angora cardigan, remember? Wore it every Christmas, even when it got too small, and pills covered the elbows. She hadn't realized she'd said, "remember," out loud, as if Silas could possibly know. But when she glanced over, he wasn't asleep in his bed. He was sitting upright, just outside the door, facing her. His green eyes were fixed on her face, utterly focused. His head was tilted slightly, the nicked ear twitching. He wasn't looking at her, he was listening. Really listening. The wind tore at his fur, but he held his ground, his gaze unwavering. It became their strange communion. Clara, bundled in an old sweater on the cold floor inside the threshold. Silas, a sentinel on the step outside. She talked, not just about her mother, but about the gnawing guilt of being relieved when the suffering ended. About the terrifying blankness of the future stretching ahead. About the stupid, everyday things that ambushed her with grief, like finding a single, forgotten tube of her mother's favorite coral lipstick in a junk drawer. She described the smell of hospitals, the sterile tang that somehow couldn't mask the underlying scent of fear and decay. As she spoke of that smell, her voice thick. Silas shifted. He didn't come closer, but he lowered himself onto his belly, stretching out on the cold concrete step, his chin resting on his paws. His eyes never left hers. His breathing, shallow puffs of white vapor in the frigid air, seemed to sync with the rise and fall of her own chest. It wasn't pity she saw in those luminous green depths. It was recognition. A shared language of survival etched in scars, both visible and unseen. Slowly, incrementally, the space between them began to shrink. One day, refilling his water bowl, Clara's knuckle accidentally brushed the soft fur between his shoulder blades as he drank. He flinched violently, a hiss escaping him, leaping back a full yard, fur bristling, eyes wide and startled. Clara froze, heart pounding. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "I'm so sorry, Silas." He stared at her, heaving the wildness back in his gaze for a terrifying moment. Then, slowly, the bristled fur smoothed. He didn't approach the water again while she was there, but he didn't vanish either. He said, watching her, the wary tension gradually easing from his frame. Trust, Clara realized, wasn't built in grand gestures, but in the careful repair of tiny fractures. Weeks passed. The heating pad hummed softly. Silas began venturing just inside the doorway after eating. Not far. Just enough so his hindquarters were out of the biting wind, while his front half remained vigilantly outside. He'd sit there, a living threshold guardian, half in the warmth, half in the cold world. Clara noticed the small details. The way the pads of his paws were rough and cracked, like worn leather. The faint, almost silvery sheen along the scar on his ear. The surprising softness of the white fur on his chest, like fresh snow. The rhythmic rumble that started deep in his chest one evening, a tentative, almost hesitant purr, when she spoke softly about her mother planting tulip bulbs every fall, hoping for spring. It was the first sound she'd ever heard him make, beyond the scrape of a bowl or the rasp of his tongue. A vibration, low and warm, resonating in the quiet space between the doorframe. It felt like a gift, a fragile, hard-won melody. Then came the snow. Not the gentle, picturesque kind, but a sudden, wet Portland dump, thick flakes swirling down in the late afternoon, quickly blanketing the neglected yard. Clara hurried out to bring Silas's bed further inside, away from the drifting flakes already dusting the step. He was huddled in it, a small, dark mound against the red fleece, looking miserably damp. As she reached for the bed, he startled, but didn't bolt. He watched her, snowflakes catching in his whiskers, melting into tiny droplets. She lifted the bed, with him still curled inside, and placed it gently on the dry linoleum just inside the kitchen. He remained perfectly still, frozen not by cold, but by uncertainty, his wide green eyes fixed on her face, then darting towards the open door leading deeper into the apartment, then back to her. The snow fell heavier, a thick, silent curtain. Clara slowly pushed the back door almost closed, leaving only a 2-inch gap. Enough for the cold air, but not enough for the swirling snow. The kitchen grew dimmer, quieter. Just the soft hum of the heating pad, the whisper of snow against the window, and the rapid, shallow breathing of a cat poised on the edge of a decision. Clara sat down on the floor again, a few feet away, her back against the kitchen cabinets. She didn't speak, just waited, watched the snow turn the world outside into a soft, gray blur. Minutes ticked by. Silas uncurled, slowly, painfully slowly. He stood in the plaid bed, sniffed the air deeply, his gaze sweeping the unfamiliar interior of the kitchen, the closed door to the living room, the boxes stacked against the wall. His muscles were taut, ready to spring back through the 2-inch gap to the known dangers of the storm. He took one tentative step, out of the bed, onto the cool linoleum. Looked at Clara. She held her breath, didn't move a muscle. He took another step, then another. Not towards the living room, but towards her. One slow, deliberate paw after the other, his claws clicking softly on the floor. He stopped, barely a foot from her outstretched legs. Close enough that she could smell the damp, earthy scent of his fur, see the individual snowflakes melting on his nose. He looked up at her face, those ancient, knowing green eyes searching hers. Then he lowered himself, not onto her lap, but onto the floor, right beside her bent knee. He curled up, tucking his nose under his scarred tail, a small, damp circle of black and white fur pressed against the faded denim of her jeans. His body radiated a faint warmth, and that tentative purr began again. Deeper this time, a steady, rhythmic vibration against her leg. Clara didn't dare move. She didn't dare breathe too deeply. Outside, the snow muffled the world. Inside, the hum of the heating pad, the soft rumble against her knee, the shared warmth in the dim kitchen. The cold, empty ache inside her chest, the one that had been her constant companion for 6 months, didn't vanish. But for the first time, it felt cradled, not by words, but by the silent, steadfast presence of a creature who knew about scars and storms and the fragile courage it took to step out of the cold. Silas had crossed the threshold, not just into her kitchen, but into the quiet, guarded space of her grief. And in that moment, pressed against her, trusting her enough to close his eyes, Clara felt the first, undeniable pull of a bond deeper than she could have imagined. He wasn't just sharing her shelter. He was sharing her silence, her loneliness, the unspoken weight she carried. And in that shared space, something new and terrifyingly tender began to take root. Winter settled deep into Portland's bones. The snow melted, leaving behind streets perpetually slick with a grimy slush and skies the color of wet cement. Inside Clara's apartment, a fragile new rhythm had taken hold. Silas was no longer a visitor at the threshold, but a quiet presence woven into the fabric of her days. He claimed a sunbeam on the worn living room rug, meticulously cleaning his white chest fur. He developed a fascination with the slow drip of the leaky kitchen faucet, batting cautiously at the droplets. He began to greet her in the mornings, not with meows, but with a slow, deliberate blink from his perch on the arm of the sofa, a silent good morning that felt more intimate than any sound. Clara found herself talking to him constantly, narrating her work, her thoughts, the mundane details of life that suddenly felt worth sharing. Think this client wants the logo bigger, or just has poor eyesight, Silas? She'd glance over, and he'd be watching her screen, head tilted, as if genuinely considering the pixelated mess. He started following her from room to room, a silent, shadowy companion. Not clingy, just present. He'd sit outside the bathroom door while she showered, a dark shape visible through the frosted glass. He'd curl up on the foot of her bed at night, a small, warm weight anchoring her against the vastness of the dark and the memories that sometimes threatened to pull her under. The deep, resonant purr, once so hesitant, now vibrated through the mattress, a tangible comfort. She finally tackled the boxes. The ones labeled Mom's sweaters, Mom's books, Mom's papers. It was agony and catharsis. Each folded sweater released a ghost of her mother's perfume. Chanel No. 5 mixed with the faint, comforting scent of lavender sachets. Silas seemed drawn to the scent. He'd rub his cheek against the cardboard flaps, leaving faint, greasy marks, his purr deepening. One afternoon, Clara pulled out a box simply labeled letters and photos. The scent was stronger here, paper and dust and time. She sat cross-legged on the floor, the box open before her, a Pandora's box of joy and sorrow. Silas settled beside her, unusually close, his shoulder pressed lightly against her thigh. His gaze, usually so observant of the room, was fixed intently on the open box. Clara lifted out a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, her mother's elegant handwriting on the envelopes. Beneath them, nestled in tissue paper, was a small, framed photograph Clara hadn't seen in years. Her mother, impossibly young, maybe 18, laughing on a beach. Wind whipping her dark hair, eyes crinkled with pure, unguarded joy. Clara's breath hitched. The sheer aliveness of the image was a physical ache. She traced the glass over her mother's smiling face, lost in the echo of that laughter. Silas moved. Not away, but closer. He stretched his neck, his nose twitching furiously, sniffing the photograph, then the tissue paper it had been wrapped in. His purr had stopped. He made a sound Clara had never heard before, a low, questioning chirp deep in his throat. Then, he did something utterly unexpected. He gently, deliberately, nudged the framed photo with his nose. Not knocking it over, but pushing it slightly, insistently towards Clara. His green eyes, wide and strangely urgent, lifted to hers. Not demanding, but showing her. "Okay, buddy," Clara murmured, a faint smile touching her lips despite the ache. "I see her. She was beautiful, wasn't she?" She carefully placed the photo aside, intending to look at it later, and reached back into the box. Silas immediately shifted his focus. His nose pressed against the bundle of letters tied with the blue ribbon. He sniffed deeply, then let out another soft, almost distressed chirp. He nudged the letters, the same way he'd nudged the photo, towards her. A flicker of unease brushed Clara's spine. It was odd, too specific. "Silas?" she asked softly. "What is it?" He looked at her, then back at the letters, then gave a small, frustrated lick to his nose. He settled back on his haunches, but his gaze remained locked on the bundle, his tail tip twitching, a subtle sign of tension she'd come to recognize. Clara pushed the feeling aside. Coincidence? He was probably just interested in the scent, the texture of the paper. She untied the ribbon, the silk whispering against itself. The letters were old, fragile, mostly from her grandmother to her mother during college. She read a few lines, lost in her mother's youthful world of exams and crushes and dorm food complaints. Silas remained utterly still beside her, watching her hands turn the pages, his intense focus almost unnerving. When she carefully retied the ribbon and set the bundle aside, he relaxed slightly, the tension easing from his shoulders. But the strangeness didn't end. It began to weave itself into their nights. Silas had become a steadfast fixture at the foot of Clara's bed. He'd curl up, purring, a warm, grounding presence. But a week after the box incident, Clara woke abruptly in the dead of night. Not from a nightmare, but from silence. The deep, rhythmic purring had stopped. The room was pitch black, thick with the stillness of 3 a.m. She lay still, listening. A soft sound reached her, a rhythmic, persistent scritch, 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 coming from the living room. Her heart hammered against her ribs. An intruder? A branch against the window? She slid silently out of bed, her bare feet cold on the floorboards. Padding cautiously down the short hallway, the sound grew clearer. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Methodical. Insistent. She peered around the doorway into the living room. Moonlight, pale and cold, filtered through the slats of the blinds, striping the floor and furniture. In one of these silvery stripes sat Silas. He was facing the wall where the box of letters and photos still sat, half unpacked. Not the box itself, but the blank wall beside it. His right forepaw was raised, claws extended, and he was dragging them slowly, deliberately down the plaster. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Over and over in the exact same spot. His head was lowered, his entire body rigid with concentration. He wasn't sharpening his claws, he wasn't playing. It looked like an attempt to dig, to get through. "Silas," Clara whispered sharply. He froze. His head whipped around, eyes wide, catching the moonlight and glowing with an unearthly, startled green. For a split second, he looked almost guilty, caught in an act he knew was forbidden. Then, the wildness Clara hadn't seen since those first wary days flashed across his face. He bolted, not towards her, but past her, a black and white streak vanishing down the hall and into the darkness of the bedroom. Clara stood frozen, the cold seeping up from the floor into her feet, spreading through her body. She flicked on the living room light. The harsh glare revealed the wall. 3 distinct, parallel grooves scored into the plaster. Fresh, white dust sprinkled the baseboard below. She walked over, ran her fingertips over the marks. They were shallow, but undeniable. She looked at the box beside it, then back at the scratches. A cold knot of unease tightened in her stomach. This wasn't random clawing. This was focused, purposeful, directed at this specific, unremarkable patch of wall. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. This time, Clara didn't get up immediately. She lay in bed, listening to the relentless rhythm, feeling a prickle of fear mixed with a terrible, dawning curiosity. When she finally rose and crept to the doorway, Silas was there again. Same spot. Same intense focus. He stopped when he sensed her, turning those luminous, unreadable eyes towards her in the moonlight. He didn't bolt this time. He just sat, staring at her, then slowly looked back at the wall. A silent plea? A warning? During the days, he was his usual self, following her, blinking slowly, purring on the sun-warmed rug. But the box, and that section of wall, held a strange fascination. He'd often sit near the box, not sleeping, just gazing at it, or occasionally sniffing it with that same deep intensity. He started avoiding the scratch section of wall, giving it a wide berth as he moved through the room, as if it radiated cold or danger. Clara found herself staring at the scratches. 3 parallel lines, like claw marks, but deeper, more deliberate than a cat's casual stretch. Like the desperate scrape of something trapped. The thought came unbidden, chilling. She remembered Silas's nicked ear, his initial skittishness, the way he'd flinched from her touch. Had he been abused? Trapped somewhere? Was this wall, somehow, triggering a memory? A phantom pain? The conflict churned within her. Part of her wanted to cover the scratches, paint over them, pretend it wasn't happening. She'd had enough of darkness, of unexplained pain. She craved the fragile peace she'd found with Silas. But another part, the part that had witnessed his silent understanding of her grief, couldn't ignore it. His behavior wasn't random destruction. It was communication. A distress signal she couldn't decipher. One evening, driven by a mix of compassion and gnawing worry, Clara sat on the floor near the scratched wall. Silas was watching her from across the room, tucked into his fleece bed, his eyes wary. She didn't look at him directly. She just traced the grooves in the plaster with her finger, slowly, thoughtfully. "Hey, Silas," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. "What's back there, huh?" She tapped the wall gently. "Something scary?" Silas didn't move, but his ears, those expressive, nicked ears, swiveled forward, utterly focused. His gaze was locked on her tapping finger. Or, Clara paused, the next thought forming, tentative, fragile. Or, something lost? At the word lost, Silas made a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible sigh. Not a meow. Not a chirp. A tiny exhalation, a release of breath she felt more than heard. His eyes, those ancient, knowing green eyes, met hers. And in them, Clara didn't see fear. Not anymore. She saw a profound, heart-wrenching sadness. A sadness that mirrored her own, but deeper, older, rooted in a mystery she couldn't grasp. The quiet apartment suddenly felt charged. The scratched wall, the box of letters, the silent cat watching her with unbearable sorrow, it all coalesced into a single, pulsing point of tension. The fragile piece was cracking. Silas wasn't just a companion in her grief. He was a creature carrying his own hidden burden, a burden etched into his being, and now into her wall. He had led her to this spot, this moment, not with words, but with paw prints on plaster and a look that spoke volumes of unspoken loss. The mystery wasn't just about the wall anymore. It was about him, about what or who he had lost. And Clara knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that ignoring it was no longer an option. The story Silas carried wasn't just his own. It was waiting, trapped behind the plaster, in the bundle of letters, or perhaps in the faded photograph of her mother's laughing face. The quiet rhythm of their lives had been shattered, replaced by the echoing scrape of claws on a wall and the deafening silence of a question hanging in the air. "What are you trying to tell me?" The scratches on the wall became a silent scream Clara couldn't unhear. Every glance at the 3 pale grooves felt like a physical tug, pulling her towards a precipice she wasn't sure she wanted to face. Silas's profound sadness, reflected in those luminous green eyes, haunted her. It wasn't just her grief he mirrored now, it was a separate, older wound bleeding into the fragile sanctuary they'd built. Ignoring it felt like a betrayal of the trust he'd slowly gifted her, of the unspoken pact forged in shared loneliness. For days, a brittle tension hung in the small apartment. Silas remained his quiet self during daylight, seeking sunbeams, observing the dripping faucet. But his nocturnal ritual continued. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Like clockwork, around 3 a.m., the sound would pierce the silence. Clara stopped getting up immediately. She'd lie rigid in the dark, listening, her heart pounding a frantic counter-rhythm to the deliberate scrape of claws on plaster. Each stroke felt like it was etching itself onto her own bones. "What's behind there?" The question echoed, relentless. "What are you trying to reach?" She started researching. Late nights, after Silas had retreated from the wall, she'd huddle over her laptop, the screen casting a cold blue glow. Cat scratching walls meaning. Repetitive behavior in cats. Signs of trauma in strays. Answers were clinical, unsatisfying. Territory marking. Anxiety. Compulsion. None captured the intense, focused, almost desperate quality of Silas's actions. None explained why it was that specific spot, beside the box holding echoes of her mother's life. One lead surfaced, buried in an obscure forum thread about rescued animals. A user described a cat obsessively scratching a closet door years after being accidentally locked inside as a kitten. "It wasn't the door," the comment read. "It was the memory of being trapped, the panic etched so deep it became a physical need to dig her way out, even when the door was open." Clara stared at the screen, a chill spreading through her. Trapped. The word resonated, dark and heavy. She remembered Silas's initial flinch, the wild fear in his eyes when startled, the rough, cracked pads of his paws. Had he been trapped? Behind this wall? Impossible. The wall was solid, interior, separating her living room from the small, unused storage closet beside it. But the feeling wouldn't shake. Driven by a mix of compassion, dread, and a fierce need to understand, Clara made a decision. She needed to look, not at the scratches, but behind them. She waited until a Saturday morning, gray and drizzly, the kind of day that muffled the world. Silas was asleep in his fleece bed, a compact circle of black and white fur, rising and falling with deep, even breaths. The rhythmic purr was absent, replaced by the soft sigh of sleep. Clara approached the wall, her toolbox, a relic from her father, untouched for years, feeling unnaturally heavy in her hand. Her fingers trembled as she traced the grooves. Plaster dust fine and white, coated her fingertips. She took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of damp Portland air mixing with the faint, metallic tang of the old toolbox. This is for him, she told herself. To help him. To silence the scream in the plaster. Carefully, silently, she positioned the edge of a small pry bar into the deepest groove. One gentle tap with a hammer, then another. A small crack spiderwebbed outwards from the groove. Silas didn't stir. Another tap. A larger chunk of plaster, about the size of her palm, crumbled away, landing with a soft thud on the worn carpet below. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the blinds. Clara leaned closer, peering into the dark cavity revealed behind the lath. It wasn't empty. Nestled amidst the dust and ancient insulation, tucked against the wooden stud, was something flat, rectangular, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, dark and stiff with age. Her breath caught. This wasn't debris. This was hidden, deliberately placed. She glanced back at Silas. Still asleep, oblivious. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum solo in the quiet room. Using the pry bar carefully, she widened the hole just enough to slip her fingers inside. The oilcloth was rough, gritty, cold. She pulled it gently, dislodging more plaster dust. It slid free, surprisingly light. Kneeling on the carpet, plaster dust coating her knees, Clara unwrapped the oilcloth with trembling hands. Inside, protected from decades of dust and damp, lay a single envelope. Plain, yellowed paper. No address. No stamp. Just a name written in faded, elegant script that stopped Clara's heart. Eleanor. Her mother's name. The air vanished from her lungs. Time folded in on itself. The drizzle outside, the smell of dust, the sound of Silas's soft breathing, all receded into a distant hum. All that existed was the envelope in her hands, her mother's name, and the impossible connection to a cat scratching a wall. With numb fingers, she turned the envelope over. The flap wasn't sealed. It was tucked in, like a secret waiting to be rediscovered. She slid out a single sheet of paper, equally yellowed, covered in the same elegant script. But as she unfolded it, something else fluttered to the carpet. Not paper. Clara picked it up. It was a dried, pressed flower. A forgotten. Its delicate blue petals almost black with age, the stem fragile as a whisper. A sob threatened to choke her. Her mother loved forget-me-nots, called them memory flowers, had pressed them in books, tucked them into letters, worn them tucked behind her ear on spring days. The sight of it, this tiny, preserved fragment of her mother's joy, unleashed a tidal wave of grief Clara thought she'd dammed up. Tears blurred her vision, hot and sudden. She clutched the fragile flower, the envelope, the oilcloth, her knuckles white. Then, she looked down at the unfolded letter and froze. The writing was her mother's? Yes. But it wasn't words that covered the page first. It was paw prints. Small, delicate, smudged in places, but unmistakable. Inked, or perhaps dipped in something dark, they marched erratically across the top half of the page, tiny trails of feline exploration frozen in time. Beneath them, her mother's handwriting flowed, the ink slightly blurred in places, as if written through tears. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, the formal salutation jarringly intimate. "I know you told me not to write, that it makes it harder. But tonight, watching the little ones, the ache is too sharp. I found this tucked away, a moment of impossible sweetness before the world broke. Do you remember? That cold April morning, just after the storm, when we found them huddled in the old crate behind the bakery. Two tiny scraps of black and white, shivering, barely bigger than my hands. Sisters, we thought. Twins in spirit, if not in fact. You named yours Whisper, for her silent ways. I called mine Shadow, for how she followed me everywhere. They were inseparable, tumbling over each other, sleeping curled tight as one creature. This little dance across the page was Shadow's first exploration of my desk, while Whisper watched from your lap. We laughed until we cried. Remember? Then, that awful week. Shadow vanishing from the garden. My frantic search, the posters, the sleepless nights. Finding her 3 days later, miles away near the rail yard, terrified, that nick on her ear bleeding. But Whisper, silent Whisper, was gone. Truly gone. Shadow searched, cried for days, stared at the door. The light went out of her. I think a part of her broke when they were separated. Just like a part of me broke when you left. Sisters, torn apart. The guilt. Eleanor, the guilt is a stone in my chest. If I hadn't left the gate unlatched, Shadow never truly recovered. She became watchful still. Haunted. And now, you're moving across the country. Taking Whisper's memory, and yours, so far away. I can't bear the thought of Shadow losing another anchor. She needs peace. She needs, not reminders. So I'm sending her with Mrs. Gable to the city, a fresh start. Maybe without these walls, without the garden where she last saw her sister, she can heal. I'm enclosing this, the paw prints, the flower from our garden the day we found them, pressed between the pages of your last letter. Not for her. For me. To bury with my guilt. Forgive me. For Shadow. For Whisper. For us. All my love, always. Marianne. Clara couldn't breathe. The words blurred, swam. Then snapped into devastating clarity. Shut up. Silas. His stillness, his watchfulness, the nicked ear, the profound sadness, the desperate scratching at the wall where her mother's past, his past, was hidden. He wasn't just a stray. He was Shadow, her mother's cat. The lost twin, forever searching for his sister. Whisper. The wall he scratched, it wasn't random. It was the wall of the house he'd lived in. The house where he'd last been whole with his sister. Where he'd been trapped, perhaps, after bolting in terror when he was lost. Where the memory, the guilt, the crushing loss, had been sealed away by a grieving young woman named Marianne. Clara's grandmother? The oilcloth, the envelope, buried decades ago, waiting. Not for Marianne. Not for Eleanor. But for him. For Shadow, now Silas, guided by a scent buried in plaster, a memory etched in grief, to the proof of what he'd lost. A choked sound escaped Clara's throat, half sob, half gasp. Silas woke instantly. His head snapped up, green eyes wide, alert. He saw her kneeling, saw the plaster dust, the hole in the wall, the oilcloth, the envelope, the delicate, dark forget-me-not clutched in her trembling hand. He saw the tears streaming unchecked down her face. For a moment, he froze, utterly still. Then, a low, guttural sound vibrated from his chest. Not a purr, not a hiss. A mournful, ragged wail, a sound of such profound recognition and sorrow it shattered the last of Clara's composure. He didn't look at the hole. He looked at the envelope in her hand, at the pressed flower. His nostrils flared, scenting decades-old paper. He pressed petals, and the lingering ghost of his own kittenhood, his sister, his lost life. He launched himself from the bed. Not towards the wall, but towards her. He didn't stop at her feet. He scrambled, claws catching slightly on her jeans, desperate, urgent, until he was in her lap, plaster dust puffing up around them. He pressed his face, his cold, wet nose, against the hand clutching the envelope and the flower. He sniffed frantically, a series of sharp, desperate inhalations. Then he nuzzled, not the objects, but her wrist. A hard, insistent nudge, over and over, accompanied by that heartbroken wail, now softened to a desperate, questioning whimper. His whole body trembled against hers. Clara understood. She lowered the envelope, the flower, to the dusty carpet, reached up slowly, her own tears falling onto his black fur. She didn't touch the envelope. She touched him. Her fingertips, trembling, brushed the nicked edge of his ear, the scar he'd carried since that awful separation. "Shadow," she whispered, the name thick with tears. "Oh, Shadow." At the sound of the name, his true name, spoken with such aching tenderness, Silas, Shadow went utterly still. The trembling stopped. The whimper died. He lifted his head, those ancient, luminous green eyes, now swimming with an emotion so raw it stole Clara's breath, locked onto hers. He searched her face, as if seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Seeing the granddaughter of the woman who had loved him and lost his sister. Seeing the keeper of his secret, the unearther of his pain. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pressed his forehead hard against her tear-stained cheek. A gesture of utter vulnerability, of shared sorrow, of profound, wordless recognition. His body relaxed, melting against her, a heavy, warm weight saturated with decades of grief finally acknowledged. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped him, a release of breath that seemed to come from the very core of his being. And then, tentatively at first, then stronger, resonating through his body and into hers, came the purr. Not the contented rumble of sunbeams. Not the hesitant vibration of tentative trust. This was a purr like the low hum of the earth itself. A purr of heartbreak, of memory, of a bond severed but never forgotten, and finally, Clara wrapped her arms around him. This cat who was suddenly so much more, burying her face in the soft fur of his neck. The scent of dust, old paper, and the faint, lingering ghost of her mother's Chanel No. 5 mingled with the warm, living smell of him. She cried freely now, great, heaving sobs that shook them both. Tears for her mother. Tears for Shadow's decades of silent loss. Tears for little Whisper, lost forever. Tears for the impossible, heartbreaking connection that had led this scarred old soul back, not to his past home, but to her, another lost soul carrying a different kind of grief. They knelt together on the dusty carpet, woman and survivor, bound by an invisible thread woven from paw prints on an old letter, a pressed forgotten, and the unbreakable echo of a lost twin. The wall had been breached, not just plaster and laugh, but the walls they'd both built around their pain. The truth, devastating, beautiful, was out. Silas was Shadow. He had a sister named Whisper. And in the wreckage of that revelation, amidst the plaster dust and tears, something new was born. Not an end, but a beginning. A shared journey, forged in the crucible of the breaking point. He wasn't just her companion in grief anymore. He was her family. A living link to her mother's hidden past, and a fellow traveler carrying the same impossible longing for someone lost. The purr vibrating against her chest wasn't just sound. It was the first fragile note of a new harmony born from the shattered pieces of their separate silences. The dust settled, literally a fine, pale film coating the living room rug, the coffee table, the forgotten mug on the counter. Metaphorically, it felt like the entire world had shifted on its axis, leaving Clara and Shadow, Silas no longer standing on unfamiliar ground. The raw, shared sobs on the dusty floor had subsided, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a strange, fragile quiet. Clara carefully gathered the oilcloth, the envelope, the precious, fragile forget-me. She placed them not back in the hole, but on her small, cluttered desk beside her monitor. A sacred corner. Shadow watched her every movement, his green eyes, still holding that deep, ancient sorrow, now also held a new kind of watchfulness. Not wary, but attentive, as if observing a ritual he understood. When she smoothed the oilcloth flat, his gaze lingered on it. When she gently placed the pressed flower beside the envelope bearing his true name, Shadow, he blinked slowly, deliberately, a silent acknowledgement. Life didn't magically transform overnight. The grief for Clara's mother, a deep, familiar ache, didn't vanish. Nor did the decades of loss etched into Shadow's very being. But something fundamental had changed. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the unspoken weight of the truth they now carried together. The scratches on the wall remained. Clara didn't patch them. Not yet. They were a testament, a scar on the plaster mirroring the scar on Shadow's ear, and the invisible scars they both bore. He never scratched there again. The frantic, desperate scritch, scritch in the dead of night ceased entirely. Instead, Shadow began a new ritual. In the evenings, after his meal, he would walk to the desk. Not jump up, just stand beside it, looking up at the oilcloth bundle. Sometimes he'd sit, gazing at it for long minutes, his tail curled neatly around his paws, that deep, resonant purr vibrating softly in his chest. A purr of remembrance, not of contentment. A sound both heartbreaking and strangely peaceful. Clara would often sit on the floor beside him, not touching, just being present. Sharing the vigil. She started talking to him differently. Not just to him, but with him, acknowledging the history he carried. Your sister, whisper, she must have been beautiful, she murmured one evening, rain drumming softly on the roof. She had your eyes, didn't she? That same green. Shadow turned his head, looked at her, then slowly back at the desk. He didn't vocalize, but the intensity of his focus, the slight softening around his eyes, spoke volumes. Grandma Mary, she loved you so much, Claire continued, her voice thick. She thought she was protecting you, sending you away. From the pain. Shadow sighed, a soft, deep exhalation. He rose, stretched, and then, for the first time, he jumped lightly onto the desk. He didn't touch the oilcloth. He didn't nudge the envelope. He simply walked past them, with a quiet dignity, and settled in a patch of late afternoon sun warming the wood surface. He curled up, facing the window, his back to the relics of his past. But his purr, that deep, earth hum purr, continued. It felt like acceptance. Not forgetting, but choosing where to rest his gaze. Daily routines took on new layers of meaning. Morning tuna wasn't just feeding a stray, it was nourishing a living piece of her family's hidden history. She scraped it into the chipped blue bowl with a newfound reverence. Here you go, Shadow, she'd say softly, the name still feeling both strange and profoundly right on her tongue. He'd approach, no longer in wary arcs, but with a quiet confidence. He'd eat, then often rub his cheek gently against her calf, a scent-marking gesture that now felt like a deliberate claim, a quiet thank you. He was hers. She was his. Bound by more than circumstance, by bloodlines, by shared loss, by the unearthed secret in the wall. The apartment itself felt different. Lighter. Somehow, despite the weight of the past now residing openly on her desk. The half-unpacked boxes lost their oppressive power. Clara found the strength, not to discard, but to integrate. She framed the photograph of her young mother laughing on the beach, placing it beside the oilcloth bundle. Generations of women, connected by love, loss, and a tuxedo cat. She unpacked her mother's favorite pink Angora cardigan. It still smelled faintly of Chanel No. 5 and lavender. Instead of packing it away, she draped it over the back of the armchair Shadow favored. He discovered it one afternoon, sniffed it deeply, then climbed onto the chair, kneading the soft Angora with his paws, purring that deep, resonant purr, before settling into a contented sleep nestled in its folds. It wasn't morbid. It was connection. A tactile bridge across time. Clara began researching. Not frantically, but with a quiet determination. She found her grandmother Marianne's obituary online. A simple notice from 12 years ago. Buried in a small-town Oregon paper. No mention of Eleanor or cats. Just, beloved mother, and a list of surviving relatives Clara didn't recognize. She traced Mrs. Gable, the woman mentioned in the letter who had taken Shadow to the city. Dead ends. Common name, decades past. The trail to Whisper, cold for over 30 years, seemed impossibly frozen. Clara felt the familiar tug of sadness. For Shadow, for the sister he'd never find. But the frantic need to solve the mystery, the one that had driven her to break the wall, had softened. Some losses, she was starting to understand, were not meant to be fixed. Only acknowledged, honored. She shared the story. Not widely, but carefully. With her therapist, who listened, her eyes widening slightly at the improbability, then softening with profound respect for the emotional truth. Grief finds its own language, Clara, she'd said gently. Sometimes, it speaks through paw prints on plaster. Clara also told her closest friend, Maya, over crackly video call. She braced for skepticism, for a gentle, "Are you sure?" Instead, Maya had cried, "Claire, that's the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing I've ever heard. He found you. Across time, through walls, he found the one person who could understand." Hearing it reflected back, Clara felt the truth of it resonate deep in her bones. Shadow hadn't just wandered into her yard. He'd been drawn, by the scent of her mother's things, the echoes of a past he knew, to the granddaughter who carried her own silent storm. Spring began its tentative approach. The relentless Portland drizzle softened. Patches of weak sunlight, pale gold, found their way through the clouds more often. Crocuses, brave little soldiers, pushed through the mud in the neglected backyard. One Saturday morning, Clara opened the back door wide, letting the damp, earth-scented air flood the kitchen. Shadow padded to the threshold, stopping where he used to sit as Silas the stray. He sniffed the air, his whiskers twitching. He looked out at the awakening yard, then back at Clara, then deliberately stepped outside. Not to roam, not to hunt. He walked a few feet onto the wet grass, still winter-brown and patchy. He lowered his head, sniffed intently at a cluster of tiny purple wildflowers struggling near the fence. Forget-me-nots. Early, fragile, but undeniably there. He didn't eat them. He didn't paw at them. He simply sat beside them, his gaze distant, thoughtful. The breeze ruffled the fur on his chest. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with a bittersweet ache. He stayed there for a long time, a black and white sentinel beside the tiny blue blooms, bathed in the weak spring sun. Remembering, but not trapped in the memory. Present, in the soft promise of a new season. Later that day, Clara took the pressed forget-me-not from the desk. So fragile, it felt like it might crumble to dust in her fingers. She didn't put it back in the envelope. She found a small, clear locket among her mother's things, one she'd worn as a teenager. She carefully, painstakingly placed the ancient flower inside. She fastened the locket, the tiny blue petals suspended behind glass, a captured memory. She didn't wear it. She placed it gently on the desk, beside the oilcloth bundle and the framed photo of her laughing mother. A trinity of remembrance. That night, Shadow didn't sleep at the foot of her bed. He curled up, as he often did now, on the pink Angora cardigan draped over the armchair. Clara lay awake for a while, listening to the soft sound of his breathing, the occasional, sleepy sigh. The apartment was quiet, but the silence was no longer hollow. It was full of the lingering scent of her mother's perfume, full of the soft rhythm of an old cat's purr, full of the echoes of a lost twin named Whisper, full of the quiet resilience of a creature who had carried his grief across decades, only to finally lay it down, not to discard it, but to share its weight. Clara thought of the wall. The hole, still gaping, a reminder of the rupture. She would patch it soon. Not to hide the past, but to integrate it. The scratches, she decided, she would leave visible beneath the fresh plaster. A ghostly reminder, a testament to the desperate need to be heard and the courage it took to listen. Shadow sighed in his sleep, a soft, contented sound. Clara closed her eyes. The world hadn't stopped spinning for her, but it had shifted irrevocably. She wasn't just Clara, grieving daughter, isolated freelancer. She was Clara, keeper of Shadow's story, granddaughter of Marianne, guardian of Whisper's memory, and in this small apartment, filled with the tangible ghosts of love and loss, she had found something she hadn't known she was searching for. Not an escape from grief, but a companion within it. Not an answer to the mystery of loss, but a profound understanding that some bonds, even severed ones, echo forever. And in that echo, there was, finally, a fragile, hard-won piece. The story wasn't over. It was simply breathing, quieter, in the shared space they had carved out of silence and plaster dust. Shadow had found his anchor. Clara, for the first time since her mother's laugh faded, felt truly at home. The journey through the breaking point hadn't ended the pain. It had transformed it, from a solitary scream into a shared, living memorial. The locket became a talisman. Clara found herself touching it absently throughout the day, running her thumb over the smooth metal, feeling the slight ridge where it clasped shut. The pressed forget-me-not, fragile as a moth's wing, seemed to hold the weight of 3 lifetimes, her mother's, Shadow's, and now, inexplicably, her own. Spring deepened. The forget-me-nots in the yard multiplied, tiny blue stars against the mud. Shadow took to sitting among them for hours, not sleeping, just watching the petals tremble in the breeze. His once ragged fur grew sleek, his movements less stiff. The haunted look in his green eyes never fully vanished, but it softened, like frost yielding to morning sun. Clara began dreaming of her mother. Not the gaunt, hollow-cheeked version from the hospice bed, but the vibrant woman from the beach photo. In the dreams, her mother was always laughing, her dark hair wind-tossed, her arms outstretched toward something just beyond Clara's vision. She woke from these dreams not with the usual crushing grief, but with a quiet, lingering warmth, as if she'd been briefly allowed to step through a door left ajar. One drizzly April morning, while Shadow dozed in his Angora nest, Clara finally tackled the hole in the wall. She gathered spackle, a putty knife, sandpaper. As she smoothed the fresh plaster over the ragged edges, she paused at the 3 visible scratch marks. She could have covered them completely. Instead, she filled them just enough to make them smooth to the touch, but left their faint outlines visible beneath the fresh white surface. A whisper of what had been. A reminder of the rupture that had led to revelation. She was cleaning up the dust when her phone buzzed, an email notification. The subject line made her fingers freeze mid-wipe. Inquiry about Gable family, Portland feline rescue. Her breath came fast and shallow as she opened it. The message was brief, professional, but it sent a current through her body. Ms. Hart, I'm the volunteer archivist at Portland Feline Rescue, formerly Portland Stray Society. Mrs. Rosalind Gable was one of our founding members in the 1980s. She passed in 2009, but her records indicate she did occasionally foster cats before adoption. Unfortunately, our files from that era are incomplete. However, I did find one handwritten note from 1991 mentioning a special case black and white male, approximate 3 years old, transferred from Baker City. Ear injury. Very quiet. Needs patient home. No name or photo, but it might be your cat. Mrs. Gable's granddaughter runs a small shelter in Beaverton. She might have more personal records. Let me know if you'd like her contact info. Best, Lydia Cho. Clara read it 3 times. Baker City, where her grandmother had lived. 1991. The timeline fit. Ear injury. The nick on Shadow's ear, now healed into that pale scar. It was him. This was the first tangible thread connecting Shadow's past to his present, the first evidence outside of that buried letter that he was who she knew him to be. She looked over at him. He was awake now, watching her with that uncanny awareness, as if he could sense the seismic shift in the room. She went to him, knelt beside the armchair, showed him the phone screen. He sniffed it politely, then nudged her wrist with his head, his version of a question mark. I found her, Clara whispered. The woman who brought you to the city, Mrs. Gable. Shadow blinked slowly, then turned his gaze to the window, where rain streaked the glass in silvery trails. He didn't react dramatically, but his breathing deepened, and that resonant purr started up, vibrating through the Angora sweater, through Clara's knees where they pressed against the chair. She emailed back immediately, requesting the granddaughter's contact information. Then, on impulse, she opened a new browser tab. Typed, Baker City Newspaper Archives 1988 Missing Cat. The search yielded nothing useful. She tried variations. Lost Kittens Bakery 1988. Stray Cats Found April 1988. Page after page of irrelevant results. Then, at the bottom of the 5th page, a link to a digitized Baker City Herald Community Bulletin board from May 12, 1988. Between notices for a church bake sale and a used bicycle for sale, a small, unremarkable entry. Lost, 2 black and white female kittens, last seen near Main St. Bakery. Reward if found. Call Marianne. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. Not one. Shadow and whisper, together. Her grandmother had posted it after they vanished, hoping against hope. And below it, a week later, another brief notice. Found. 1 black and white kitten with nicked ear near rail yard. Call same number. Should've. Found alone. Whisper, never recovered. Clara printed both notices, the ink faint on the cheap printer paper. She didn't show them to Shadow. Some truths, she sensed, were better carried for him. But she placed them carefully in the oilcloth bundle with the letter and the locket. The full story, as much as she could piece together, now preserved. That night, she dreamed again of her mother. This time, the beach was different, wilder, the waves crashing violently against black rocks. Her mother wasn't laughing. She was kneeling in the sand, her hands cupped around something small and dark. As Clara approached, her mother looked up, tears streaming down her face. She opened her hands. Resting in her palms were two tiny black and white seashells, perfectly matched, except one had a small chip on its edge. The dream shifted before Clara could speak, and she woke with a start, the first light of dawn seeping through the blinds. Shadow was not in his usual spot on the armchair. She found him sitting on the desk, perfectly still, gazing at the oilcloth bundle. Not pawing at it, not agitated, just looking. As she entered, he turned his head toward her, and in the pale morning light, his green eyes held an expression so profoundly peaceful it made her throat tighten. He blinked slowly, then hopped down, padding silently to his food bowl in the kitchen. Business as usual, but something about the moment felt ceremonial, as if he'd been paying respects, or saying goodbye. The email from Mrs. Gable's granddaughter came 2 days later. Attached was a scanned photo, grainy with age, showing a much younger version of the woman Clara recognized from obituary photos. She stood in what looked like a sunlit porch, smiling down at a black and white cat in her arms. The cat's face was turned toward the camera, one ear distinctly nicked. Younger, thinner, but unmistakably him. The email read, "Grandma Roz rarely took photos of Foster's, but she made an exception for this one. She called him her soul cat, said he was the quietest, saddest creature she'd ever met, but that there was something special about him. He stayed with her almost a year before she found him the perfect quiet home with a nice widow. I don't have records of where he went after that, but knowing Grandma, she would have checked in. There's a note here about Mitch on 43rd. Maybe Margaret or Mary? Sorry I can't be more help. P.S. He really did have extraordinary eyes, didn't he?" Clara studied the photo, tracing Shadow's youthful face on the screen. He'd been through so much. Lost his sister. Passed from her grandmother to Mrs. Gable, then to some kind widow, and then, through whatever twists of fate, back to her. A full circle spanning decades. She printed the photo too, adding it to the growing archive in the oilcloth. That evening, she made a decision. She cleared a space on the living room wall, between the framed beach photo of her mother and a small watercolor she'd bought at a flea market. She hung the locket there, on a tiny brass hook, where the forget-me-not could catch the light. Then she arranged the photo of young Mrs. Gable holding Shadow beside it, and below them both, she placed the 2 newspaper notices. Not hidden in a bundle anymore. Not buried in a wall. On it. Visible. Shadow observed the entire process from his armchair perch, his tail twitching occasionally, but otherwise still. When Clara stepped back to survey her work, he jumped down, approached the wall. He didn't try to touch anything. He simply sat before the small display, his gaze moving from the locket to the photo to the clippings. Then, he did something extraordinary. He lifted one paw and gently, deliberately, touched it to the wall beneath the locket. Not a scratch. Not a dig. Just a soft press of beans against plaster. A quiet acknowledgement. A benediction. Clara knelt beside him, tears welling but not falling. He turned his head, met her gaze, and blinked slowly. She blinked back. No words. None needed. The wall, once a silent witness to his desperate grief, now held his history with dignity. The lost sister. The journey. The improbable homecoming. Later that night, as Clara lay reading in bed, Shadow abandoned his usual spot on the Angora sweater. He climbed onto the bed, but didn't settle at her feet as usual. He walked the length of the mattress, pausing near her shoulder. Then, with a quiet determination, he curled up in the hollow between her arm and her chest, his back pressed against her, his purr a deep, steady vibration against her ribs. His weight, his warmth, his trust was overwhelming. Clara carefully rested her cheek against the soft fur between his ears, breathing in his scent, warm and faintly dusty, with the barest hint of her mother's perfume still clinging to him from the sweater. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, gentle against the window. The locket on the wall caught the lamplight, the tiny blue flower suspended in its glass prison, yet somehow, finally, free. Shadow sighed deeply, his body relaxing into hers. Not just resting, not just trusting, belonging. The final gift wasn't in the discoveries, the photos, the clippings. It was in this moment, the quiet understanding that some bonds transcend time, that love leaves echoes in the most unexpected places, and that healing isn't about forgetting, but about finding the courage to carry the past into the light. Together, the summer came softly to Portland, a slow unfurling of green leaves and golden light. The forget-me-nots in the yard bloomed wildly, a sea of tiny blue stars that Shadow would wander through each morning, his black and white fur brushing against the petals like a living paint stroke. Clara often watched him from the kitchen window, her coffee steaming in her hands, marveling at how far they'd both come. The hollow ache of her mother's absence hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. No longer a jagged edge, but a softened weight, something she could carry without bleeding. The wall where Shadow had scratched was smooth now, the 3 faint lines barely visible beneath the fresh paint. A scar, like the one on his ear, like the one on her heart. The locket and the photographs hung above it, a quiet memorial to the journey that had brought them together. Clara found herself touching the locket often, not with grief, but with gratitude. The pressed flower inside, once a symbol of loss, had become something else entirely. A reminder that love, even when buried, never truly dies. Shadow had changed too. He still carried that deep, watchful wisdom in his green eyes, but the frantic edge was gone. No more midnight scratching. No more restless pacing. He moved through the apartment with a quiet confidence, as if he'd finally laid down a burden he'd carried for decades. He still loved his Angora nest, still followed Clara from room to room, still blinked slowly at her when their eyes met. But now, there was a lightness to him, a peace. One evening in late July, Clara sat on the floor with him, the windows open to the warm night air. Crickets sang outside, their rhythmic chirping blending with the distant hum of the city. Shadow lay stretched out beside her, his chin resting on her knee, his purr a steady, soothing vibration. She ran her fingers gently over his fur, tracing the contours of his spine, the ridge of his shoulders. He sighed, a sound of utter contentment. "Shadow," she murmured, not for any reason, just to say his name. He lifted his head, looked at her with those ancient, knowing eyes. In them, she saw the reflection of every person who had ever loved him. Her grandmother Marianne, who had buried her guilt in a wall. Mrs. Gable, who had called him her soul cat. The kind widow on 43rd Street whose name they'd never know. And now her, the granddaughter who had unknowingly been waiting for him all along. He nudged her hand with his nose, then stood, stretching his aging limbs with deliberate care. He walked to the wall where the locket hung, sat before it, his tail curled neatly around his paws. Clara joined him, sitting cross-legged beside him, their shoulders almost touching. Together, They looked at the tiny blue flowers suspended in glass, at the photographs, at the faint scratches beneath the paint. A lifetime of love and loss, distilled into this quiet corner of a small apartment. Shadow turned his head, looked at Clara, then reached out one paw. Not to the wall this time. To her. He placed it gently on her knee, the pads of his beans warm against her skin. A silent acknowledgement. A thank you. A promise. Clara covered his paw with her hand, feeling the slow, steady beat of his pulse beneath her fingers. No words passed between them. None were needed. The moment stretched, sweet and endless, until Shadow withdrew his paw, gave one last lingering look at the locket, then turned and padded toward the bedroom. Clara remained where she was for a while longer, listening to the crickets, feeling the warm breeze on her face. She thought of her mother, of the laugh captured in that beach photo. She thought of Whisper, the lost twin, whose memory had woven itself into the fabric of their lives. She thought of the improbable journey that had led Shadow back to her, across decades, through walls, guided by nothing but love and the unshakable pull of fate. When she finally rose to join him, she paused in the doorway, watching as he settled into his favorite spot at the foot of her bed. He blinked up at her, slow and deliberate, his green eyes glowing in the dim light. Clara blinked back. Then she turned off the light, climbed into bed, and let the rhythm of his purr lull her into sleep. Outside, the world kept turning. Cars passed on the wet streets. Lights flickered in distant windows. Somewhere, perhaps, another lost soul was finding its way home. But in this small apartment, with its mended walls and its quiet memorials, there was only peace. The kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from remembering. Not from moving on, but from carrying the past with grace. The kind of peace that blooms, fragile and enduring, like a forget-me-not pushing through cracked concrete. Like love, returning when it's needed most. And as Clara drifted into dreams, shadows per the last sound she heard, she knew. This wasn't an ending. It was the quiet, everlasting beginning they'd both been waiting for. Before you go, if this story touched your heart, smash that like button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Your stories inspire us every day. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our daily tales of love, loss, and unexpected homecomings. Share this with someone who understands the unbreakable bond between humans and the creatures who save us in ways we never see coming. And remember, the most extraordinary stories are the ones waiting just beneath the surface of the ordinary. You never know what you might find when you dare to look. Good night, dreamers. Until the next story begins. Blue Heart.